Good evening, and welcome to church. My name is Melissa, and I help with the Renaissance artist community. I'll be reading 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 12. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you is not without results. We had previously suffered and had been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. You know we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good evening, folks. Just before we jump into this passage tonight, just wanted to make one or two short comments here. How many of you had a chance to pop into our prayer room during that little 31-hour window that sort of erupted there? Yes, that was really something quite significant. We believe this happened Monday night as well, just for 5 hours. And I just want to say this, God is drawing near. And one of the great challenges that God has is that when his presence comes and his glory manifests itself, it's a heavy presence. Even if it's a joyful presence, it's like crushing joy. And you'd be amazed in history how many leaders of revivals, their prayer was, stop God or I'm going to die. So one of the things that we think God is doing is expanding our capacity. Several years ago, you are familiar with the story. I spent 13 years praying for revival on Saturday nights, that God would do something in our services. And one night felt a very, very strong sort of challenge from the Lord. Don't pray for revival. So I called my mentor and he says, this is probably 6 years ago. And he said, your soul is not big enough to contain a move of God. It would crush you. I always remember thinking at the time, you sure? Well, if you're involved in that 31 hours, the answer is yes, I'm sure. The Asbury outpouring that happened down in Asbury almost crushed them. And they had an entire college, a building, a staff, and a seminary across the street, along with a whole network of leaders who've been praying for 20 years, and it still almost crushed them. So all that to say, what I think God is doing is he's giving us reps in his presence, and he's trying to build our capacity. And so I don't think the question is, are we going to miss out on what God's doing? I have no doubt we'll be a part of it. The question is, will we be able to handle what God is doing? And that right now is no, we would not be able to handle it. So I think I just want to encourage you, lean in. Things like this, moments like this are built on people who sort of drop everything, clear their schedules. One of the great joys behind the scenes, we had people who were out of town who said, I'll be on the next plane if you need me. Friends from around the country who said, if this thing rolls over, let me know. I will be there to help. So we've got friends who want to roll in, but we want our church to roll in first before everybody else shows up. So just want to invite you into that. Evan Roberts, who helped lead the Welsh revival in 1904, had this prayer in the middle of the Welsh revival. And here was his prayer, oh, for the strength of frame to bear this weight of glory. after a year, he was completely burned out and only appeared a couple of times in public for the rest of his life. Just walloped him. So this is all very encouraging, and what I want to say to you is, please lean into this. Grow your capacity. The idea of running the New York City Marathon is great. Training for the New York City Marathon is what's needed to run the marathon. Singing all these songs, we want to close the gap between what we experience and these are all great sayings. We mean them. But to mean them and to prepare yourself for them is something fundamentally different. So I just want to say this is something God's doing. I want to encourage you to lean into it, prepare. Don't just pray. And I'm excited for the days that are ahead. Okay, this passage tonight I want to jump into. This is a heavy passage. This is a passage on how to deal with the total crisis of trust and disillusionment that is happening around leadership in the Christian church. I've heard a phrase begin to emerge more and more. It's not a phrase that I've heard before. I know we had Me Too, and that was followed up by Church Too. I know the Catholic Church in Boston had documentaries and movies made about its scandals and cover-ups. Evangelicals have had their own share of sexual predators and celebrity scandals and ministry implosions. But this phrase, church hurt, I know about all those things, but church hurt is new, and it's a phrase that is not normally connected to the huge, big scandals. It's just connected to how church is happening in the modern world. And it's just people who kind of say, I think I'm done with church. The church is supposed to be a place of healing. It's supposed to be a space of restoration. And I've come to church, and it's ended up being a place of tremendous pain. And so these days, for the most part, or certainly a lot more than normal, when people step into a church, they're stepping in with a hesitancy I've never witnessed in my 26 years of pastoring. It's a hesitancy and a cynicism and a suspicion around leadership. It used to be when we did Welcome to Church, the number one question people asked was, how do I get in a small group? The number one question I hear now is, who's keeping you accountable? And there's sort of a suspicion about the institution, the structures, the way that churches are run in the modern world. I think a lot of times people have been so disillusioned when they see behind the curtain of how church leaders live and what they value and those sorts of things. It's like the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy is there with a dog. It's Toto, yes? With her dog Toto. And she's trying to get back home. She's lost. And when she finally makes it through all of these challenges to go see the wizard, she pulls the curtain back and it's just a scared man who can't get home himself. There's a lot of folks who feel like they've finally gotten their way into church leadership, and they pull behind the curtain and it's just scared, insecure people using the church for their own ego who can't figure out what to do with their lives either. So there's a tremendous suspicion and hermeneutic around the church. New York City's been rocked by church scandals. Not sure if you're aware of this, you probably are. And so as a church in New York City, as a pastor in New York City, we have to ask ourselves the question, and it's an important question, how can we restore trust and credibility in a scandalized church? For whatever reason, God in his sovereignty has put our church here and has given us some measure of leadership in the kingdom ecosystem, and we're going to be accountable for that. So what are the keys? Does this passage have something to say to restoring trust and credibility to the church? Jesus is always trying to get a church without spot and blemish. The question about your discipleship, my leadership, is our collective efforts going to wash away those spots and blemishes or leave more for the coming generation? That's the challenge that's before us. Now, the passage from this teaching text today is a very helpful passage because Paul is pastoring in the midst of incredible controversy and incredible resistance. He says in this passage that he says, you know how we were previously treated outrageously in Philippi. And wherever Paul went, he experienced tremendous resistance. So when he goes to Philippi, he casts the demon out of the slave girl that can predict fortunes. It starts that the owners are upset. This gets him in trouble with the city. They're beaten. They're thrown in jail. Turns out he's a Roman citizen and you can't do that. And then Paul ends up leaving Philippi. He comes to Thessalonica. He preaches the gospel in the synagogue. His preaching is so empowered by the Holy Spirit. Huge crowds of people begin to follow Jesus. This makes the religious leaders jealous, so they stir up a crowd. A riot breaks out in the city. They come before the city council, blaming the local leaders who were there. So Paul has to escape by night. He goes to the next town, and some of those leaders follow him to the next town. Now, part of the challenge is in the vacuum of his absence, having to flee for his own life, false teachers come in and they make two accusations. The first accusation is about Paul's character. Back in the Greco-Roman world, they didn't have the NFL or the UFC or whatever you're into. And so often what they were left with was traveling philosophers who would come into town and give lectures. They would take money and sleep with the women, and then they'd move on. And this is part of their form of entertainment. And here's what these people who wanted to take advantage of the Thessalonians started saying: Paul's just like that. You can't trust his character. If he really loved you, he'd be with you. Where's your man now? And they began to impugn his authority, attack his authority. They said, what do you even know about him really? What are his credentials? Where do you go to seminary? How can we trust him? What sort of ministry credibility is there to believe that he's really one sent from God? And so Paul is dealing with a tremendous sense of heartache. He wants to be back with his people. His leadership is being slandered and criticized. There's riots, controversies, and then Paul writes back with three remarkably timely words about how to have credible leadership in the midst of scandal and crisis. That's what we're going to look at today. Paul's going to give us three things. They're simple but potent. Number one, in order to restore credibility, you've got to look at a leader's motives. It's about God doing a work in a leader's motives. It's about the way leaders lead. It's not enough just to have a good heart. The methodology of leadership has to be godly. And then the point of a leader's energy, the mission that he leads people into. So let's see what Paul says to the Thessalonians to establish credibility in the midst of the crisis. Number one, leadership motives. This is about why leaders lead. Motives are everything. Without godly motives, all you're left with is personalities, popularities, programs, and power struggles. Look what Paul says. For the appeal that we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. What a phrase. We're not trying to please people, but we're trying to please God. This is the first clarification Paul gives about a leader's motives. They've got to be Godward motives. They're about pleasing God. Now look, the church is filled with people. Are you aware of that? Pastors, leaders, these are people. And so often people go into leadership for all sorts of reasons. You can never quite know, and sometimes leaders don't even know. Sometimes there's like a huge volunteer deficit and they're just like, you're up. Are you breathing and half filled with the Holy Ghost? You're up. And they'll just put people into leadership out of need. Sometimes you get environments of ungodly ambition where the flesh is cultivated to try and activate your desire to exercise leadership. A lot of times the leaders get into leadership and they're dealing with huge unformed areas of their life, deep deficits in their character, their emotional health, and the interior parts of their life. I read a remarkable book on how the shadow side of leaders is formed, and one of the core ideas they have is what he calls Maslow gaps, which means that in childhood, there's these basic fundamental needs that children have, and if they're not met, they will strive as adults subconsciously to fill those needs once they get power and have the ability to achieve. So sometimes if a person grows up in a home without affirmation, they'll spend their adult years, I'll show you, proving people wrong. Sometimes if they grow up and they're very, very poor, they'll work hard and they'll think everything's about security and accumulating resources. There can be 1,000 reasons that people go into leadership. Sometimes people just love affirmation from a crowd. And so they go into leadership because of this sort of the buzz they get feeding off the people who are in front of them. So there's a great challenge on one side. People can go into leadership to please themselves. It's all about them. My leadership, my ministry, my thing. Other times you get people who go into leadership and they're just people pleasers. They're drawing off the effort. So people pleasing themselves. siphon off energy from the crowd for self-fulfillment. Those who want to please people get their sense of worth on getting affirmation from those that they are serving. Self-fulfillment and serving other people are not the primary motivations for leadership. You've got to have a vertical, God-oriented desire to be in leadership. John Stott says this: no secret of Christian ministry is more important than a fundamental God-centeredness, a God orientation in leadership. Look, I'm going to tell you, you can walk through my life, and I'm going to tell you, you're not going to find a scandal in my life. If you look at how I spend money, if you look at where I give my money, if you look at where my time goes, if you look at my marriage, if you look at my family, if you look at the people who serve with me, you're not going to walk around and say, aha, a scandal, okay? Most of the big sins are out of my life at this point, okay? But you know the thing that terrifies me the most? The more I walk with Jesus, the more I find that he is getting down to the sciatic nerves of my spirit and the deep motivational structure of my heart and fine-tuning why I do what I do more than anything else. And I'm going to tell you, when I was a new believer, it was actually quite easy to get rid of the big sins. Hey, I was doing that before, now I'm a follower of Jesus, probably should stop doing that. And the level of guilt and shame, and I was like, get that out of here. But when God starts going into the deep motivational structure of your heart, I always, whenever Paul called himself a chief of sinners, I was like, well, maybe he's struggling with his identity. Doesn't he know who he is in Jesus? Doesn't he trust the cross? The closer I get to Jesus, I'm like, chief of sinners, chief of sinners. Because the more you have a revelation of how holy God is at the depth of your being, the more God's going to deal with the why you do what you do and not just the what that you do. So the first part is about learning to please God, making sure we have a Godward orientation in what we do. Second thing he says is we have to be entrusted and accountable. He says we've been approved by God as those entrusted with the gospel. Now, the idea in the Greek here is the idea of somebody who's been put through a rigorous test and passes that test. And what Paul is saying is that he has been tested in his ministry to the point where God has now trusting him to faithfully and with integrity represent who God is and what he teaches to other people. It's passing the ministry tests. Now, this is important. I'm very, very grateful that when I came up in ministry, I came up in a ministry that sort of beat the stuffing out of you on the way up. And they were always like, man, you got to, so the first test you had to pass was the servanthood test. And they were like, hey, John, what was your first, what was it like going into ministry? And I was like, well, I actually started off as the groundskeeper at the church. So, in Texas, when it's 110 degrees for 30 days in a row, I was with a weed eater and a blower, basically putting myself like, this is what the age to come is like without Jesus. Do not do this forever. It was so hot, it was horrific. Then I graduated and got a promotion because of my faithfulness doing the grounds to being a janitor. And you're like, it was indoors, man. It was so cool. Doing toilets as if Jesus was going to use them. That was my motivation. Literally, I was like, you ever been into a public restroom at a gas station and been like, oh? And you ever walked in and just been like, thank you. I wanted to produce that thank you response because of my janitorial work. And then I was a middle school youth pastor. And I just slowly worked my way. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was being put through a series of tests. Will I serve without attention? Will I serve without glamour? Will I be faithful with a little? And so over the course of time, it was working my way up into ministry. One of the challenges in the modern world is that we can bypass character for charisma. Most of the leadership failures that happen because people have more influence than they have character. And so the influence is too much for their spirits to bear, and they collapse under the weight because they haven't been formed properly. And so it's making sure that people are trained and tested with the gospel. I'm not talking about formal education. I've been to seminary. I have a graduate degree in theology. To be honest with you, I appreciate it, but it did very, very little to form my inner man. Most of that came through serving in humility, obscurity, leadership, pain, and challenges. People ask in our church, well, how do leaders get into your church? And it's actually more robust than you would think. To become a leader in our church, someone has to vouch for you. Hey, I know them. I've seen their life and their character. You have to go through an interview. And some of the most painful things that happen in our church, some of the things that upset people in our church the most, is they want to go into leadership and they're recommended that this is not the season or they're not ready. So you have to go through an interview. Then you have to go through like a training portal that covers 4 things. Theology, what our church believes, the doctrinal theological convictions it holds. Our ethical positions on controversial issues like sex, money, and power. Our church's vision on what spiritual authority is and how to submit to authority in a godly way. What our church's mission is. At the end of that, if you have any questions, you go through another series of clarifications and interviews. If you agree with all of that, pass the interview, you sign a leadership covenant that determines the way that you're willing to lead and model spiritual authority in our church. And then if you fall short of that covenant, you will lovingly be held accountable to it. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's quite robust. I'm like, yeah, leadership is a high calling. And so we want to produce leaders in our church who God says can be entrusted with authority. Next thing Paul says about motives, it's about establishing credibility. There should be a visible reality to the lives of people following Jesus that you can see. Look at what he says. He's making an appeal, remember. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We work night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. You're our witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. So he wants to make 3 claims here. Number 1, we were holy towards God, which means they had a kind of holiness that modeled the holiness of God, the way they lived towards the community. They said we lived righteously towards one another. You couldn't go into their life and accuse them of having improper behavior or financial impropriety or sexual immorality or a domineering kind of leadership. The way they acted in community was righteous, and then they lived blamelessly towards the world. It doesn't say they lived sinlessly. It doesn't say there wasn't controversy. It just says upon inspection, none of the charges would stick. And this is important because when Paul is appealing to the Thessalonians, I want you to see how many times he says, you witnessed our lives with your own eyes. Look at what he says here. He says, for you yourselves know, 2 verse 1, as you know, 2 verse 2, as you know, 2 verse 5. God is our witness, 2 verse 5. For you remember, 2 verse 9, you were our witnesses and so is God, 2 verse 10. And as you know, 2 verse 11. And Paul wants him to say, do not listen to those accusing us. What do you even know about them? But you remember the life we lived in front of you, towards God, towards you, and towards the outside world. So his inner life, Paul is saying, can be authenticated by the life he lived in community. First thing we've got to do to restore credibility is fine-tune the motivational structure of our hearts as to why we get into leadership. Now, listen, you guys still here? It's hot. You think it's hot sitting there? You should try preaching under these lights. Here's what I want to say to you. New Yorkers are some of the most ambitious people on earth. Thank God. Ambition is a gift. I would rather redirect ambition than try and wake the dead. But I can tell you this, that ambition has to go through a process of conversion. James is going to say in the book of James that if worldly ambition and bitter envy get into the church, it's going to wreak hell inside the church. He says, there you will find disorder, every evil conduct, and even that it is demonic. And so we've got to make sure in all of our championing of the ambition of people in New York, that ambition is properly sanctified, washed and touched by Jesus. So it's godly ambition, not worldly ambition. Listen, it's easy to build a church on finding the worldly ambition in a person's heart, baptizing it with the shallow immersion of theology, and then taking people's worldly ambition and putting Jesus on top of it. And honestly, that's a lot of what's caused the failure that we've witnessed. And so you probably got to do a season in obscurity. You probably got to have a little wilderness. You got to probably have a little grounds crew janitorial stuff in there. I'm just saying, because if you want the stage too quickly and you don't have the character to bear it, it will cause trouble in the Christian community. Holy ambition, not worldly ambition, is the key. Number 2, Paul's going to talk about not just why he did it, his motives, but how he did it. And this is about the methods that are used to lead. Look what he says. You know, we never used flattery, nor do we put on masks to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. This is fascinating. Paul is giving us some phenomenal insights about how leaders manipulate people. And he says this, first thing they do is they use flattery. Anytime you find yourself saying something about someone you don't believe in your heart, you need to stop speaking. That is flattery. And it's a sure sign if you change your behavior around different groups of people. I'm not talking about showing respect or operating in different spheres. Sometimes that's necessary. We have different roles in different areas of our lives. But I'm talking about consciously using language to manipulate and gain favor. Paul just calls that a leadership sin. He calls it flattery. And then he says putting on masks, which is pretending to be something you're not, pretending to be better than you are, or pretending to like something that you don't like. He's like, these are key ways that, have you ever met someone who just loves everything you love? I love those people. But then he says, here's the real reason. These people are hungry for compliments. What they really want is praise. They're pretending to be something they're not. They're manipulating you by their words and their speech. Anytime someone comes up to me, they're like, Pastor John, honestly, you just changed my life. This is so amazing. I'm like, thank you. I mean, I'm just like, maybe that's sincere, but it makes me nervous. It makes me nervous because we just live in a world where people ache for affirmation. And manipulative people can know that exhausted and tired leaders can be susceptible to those who give disproportionate affirmation. Now, let me just pause right here. It's way better than criticism. I'll tell you that right now. So I'll take it. But I'm just saying we've got to be aware of these sort of dynamics. So here's what Paul says. We didn't do that when we came to you. So what did he do? These are revelatory insights Paul gives us. He says this, we used influence, not power. Influence, not power. He says this, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have exerted our authority. He says we didn't do this. We did not exert our authority. Now, the evangelical church has an unhealthy relationship with getting power. Incalculable damage was done in the last couple of elections by Christians thinking that ungodly politicians could make America Christian again. And it just doesn't work like that. And so often we can be obsessed with trying to gain. And listen, I get it. America is, if you study the rise and fall of civilizations, the US is at the final stage of decline. So when you study how the Roman Empire collapsed, the Roman Empire rotted from within. And America is like at the point where it's rotting from within. There's no sociological phenomenon that can save America. Okay, so any attempt to like get it, and listen, there's a place for politics in the economy of God, the kingdom of God. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm just saying grasping to do in the immediate what is really an interior work of the gospel never produce. You cannot use ungodly fruit and get godly fruit. It just doesn't work like that. Power is about compliance by force. Influence, if you study Daniel Goleman's emotionally intelligent leader, he basically talks about 4 levels of leadership. And the highest level of leadership is what he calls resonant leadership. And a resonant leadership is when someone says, bro, that's exactly what it feels like in my heart. You know why I love Corey Russell so much? I'm a Corey Russell fangirl. You want to know why? Because I'm like, that's what it sounds like in my heart. When I hear him, I'm like, that resonates in me. He's not beating me up. He's not coercing me. What's in my spirit is given expression through his life. The highest level of leadership is resonant leadership. And here's what Paul says. I don't want to use power to force you. I want to get into your spirits through the beauty of Jesus and the power of the gospel and change you from the inside out. Here's the thing. When you look at Paul's life, Paul had a little bit, but almost no cultural agency. He's a Roman citizen, but Rome hated him, okay? So it didn't really help him that much. He ends up being beheaded by Nero. But even though he had almost no cultural power, Paul has gone on to become one of the most influential people in all of history. Sometimes our grasping for power only reveals the lack of influence we truly possess. The saints have almost nothing. The desert fathers in history have almost nothing except their character. And yet they were able to shift history and change nations through the weight of their being, not the cultural power that they had accumulated. Tim Keller says this: the only condition under which people change from the inside out is if they're getting their teaching from someone they know loves them. Truth without love is a power play. So it's the way he did it, influence versus power. Second thing I want you to see is it's about relationships versus content. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this. You can get better content than my preaching on the internet. If you go online, there's better teachers than me on the internet. You can go online and you can get access to all the greatest scholars in history. I have, upon last checking, 12,000 volumes of theology on my phone. So none of you, no offense, can say something about the book of Romans better than Douglas Moo. Sorry, that's his name. His whole life work is the book of Romans. But really, are we having a content problem? We're not having a content problem. What we're having is a failure of relationships. Paul's methods wasn't content dumping, it was relationship building. Look at what he says, verse 9. So we cared for you because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Paul loved the Thessalonians. God put something in his spirit for the Thessalonians. The language he uses when he says we were torn away from you, it's the idea of somebody who's been orphaned. It's language so strong that it's almost exclusively used in Greco-Roman culture of the pain felt when a family member dies. So when Paul has to run away, basically to preserve his life, he doesn't feel like, oh, well, I'll write you a couple of letters and we'll be good here. He literally feels like a part of him has died because he can no longer be in relationship with the people that he were a part of. His whole vision was not just content dumping, but a relational, holistic, whole life impartation. Much of the fruit of my life is simply the impartation of the lives of other godly people into my life. I did learn some stuff in Bible college. I did learn some stuff in seminary. I did learn some stuff. But most of the things that have helped me have not been books. They've been leadership lessons and love that's been imparted to me. Got a picture for you here. This guy you're about to see impacted my life more than anybody else in my life. How many of you recognize who that is? Just put your hand up. The reason you don't recognize who that is because none of you have a clue who that is. That is a guy from Australia who at the time worked in the Australian military in the weapons testing department as an engineer. And I was just like a little whippersnapper at youth group, just like all zeal, no skill. And he was like, man, you got a real heart for God. Has anybody trained you? And I was like, in what? He's like, do you want to be good at following Jesus? And I was like, yes. So this is a guy who just as a lay person got up at 4 a.m. 3 mornings a week to meet with me because that's the only time I had available. He taught me how to pray, taught me how to read the Bible, taught me how to answer hard questions to my faith with people at work, taught me how to overcome sin, resist temptation, taught me how to love people, he's the first guy that let me in the pulpit to preach, then gave me feedback on how to preach. I just found a video of me preaching at a service he let me preach at. Terrifying. But you know what? I look back at it now and I go, man, was he kind and encouraging based on what he was working with. Many of you have heard, I've used this line a lot because it's one of the strongest exhortations I've received and I've clung to it with all my might. He said to me, John, you've got a deficit because you dropped out of high school. You're going to have a chip on your shoulder about learning. And when you go to America, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to college and you're going to realize you're smart. You're not an idiot. And that chip on your shoulder and that realization of your intellectual gifts is going to cause you to want to strive academically to prove to people that you have what it takes. And he said, I just want to urge you, never get good grades at the cost of walking with Jesus like you've learned to know him. He said, trust me, 20 years from now, no one's going to ask what you got in New Testament Greek, but everybody will be able to see if the hand of God is on your life. What an exhortation, man. I've been in conscious seasons. It was like, why can't you do both? Because we have limited amounts of time is the answer. I made a B in New Testament Greek. So anyway, my point is, this is a father speaking into my life. When I get to heaven, you know, like no matter what, everything God's done in my life, a huge part of it is because one guy invested in me when I was 19. This is a relational impartation. Now, that may sound intense. Paul's going to dial up the ante a little stronger. Look at what he goes. He goes this from like mentor, relational language to familial language. He's going to move from theological tutors to spiritual mothers and fathers. Look at what he says. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Now, let me just pause for a sec. Is there any more tender image of care on planet Earth than a mother with her child in the human species? A mother and a child. You know that concept of the mother bear? Don't mess with that child. Mothers will lift up a car for their kid. You know what I'm saying? There is a fierceness and a love and a power between a mother and a child. And here's what Paul says. That's how we were with you. Now, this is Paul, the apostolic leader. This is Paul who gets stoned to the point they think he's dead. He gets up and is like, whoa, that was wild. Some scholars think that's when he went up to heaven. Comes back down, and it says he walked back into the city the next day. Try shutting that guy down. I thought we killed you. Yeah, but I'm back. This is a man who was beaten with rods, received the lashes, skin torn off his back, survived a day and night at sea. You think that's all these shark attacks off the coast of New York, terrifying. Imagine a day and a half just like, Lord, Father, please protect me. Wild life. And yet when he gets the Thessalonians near him, what does he say? Gentle, man, just gentle. The centrality of gentleness in leadership work with new Christians is fundamentally required. Look at what Ronald Rolheiser says. Evolution works through this principle, the survival of the fittest. One of the essential elements of Christian discipleship demands that we work for this principle, the survival of the weakest and the gentlest. And this is why Nietzsche hated Christianity. He thought it was a plague, a disease amongst the human species, because it guaranteed that the weak and the sick would survive rather than only the strong. Sharing the gospel and sharing our life. The verb rendered tenderly literally means to warm with body heat. You know, in the winter here, it's super cold. You've got mums with the baby bjorns, okay? And they're just walking around. And they've got this freezing cold, there's you can see the air. And they've got a tiny little baby all asleep. You know, when they're and you're like, oh. And they're they lift the little hood up so you can see their little eyes. And you're like, oh, it's just like one of those tender moments. The reason the baby is warm, because the mother, her whole being is keeping this kid warm. Here's what Paul says. Your faith was being kept alive in the coldness of the godless Roman Empire by my heart. I drew you in so close to my heart. I literally warmed you with my love. Is that not an intimate and tender metaphor of leadership care? I have a strong personality, if you get to know me. I've got everything I do is pretty extreme. You know, I'm never having a good day. It's amazing or it sucks. It's I'm living towards the edges. And what this can do is produce a kind of intense, it's great in small doses. But if you're I don't know, my family, it has a different sort of effect. And so I've been trying to figure out how can I be more encouraging to my family, because I'm always about this Kaizen spirit of continual improvement. And I'm always how do we make it better? How do we make it better? How do we make it better? So I was doing this research, came across this Harvard Business Review article on the perfect criticism to encouragement ratio. Here's what it is, 5.61 to 1. 5.6 encouragements for every improvement that you want to offer to somebody else. Now, I'm not a rookie. I've been preaching a while. So the illustration I'm about to share with you, I got approved by my wife yesterday, okay? So I went out with Christy yesterday and just to ask, what sort of emotional tone am I creating for our family? And she said, you have improved so much. In fact, my daughter called my wife and said, is Dad okay? Is he sick? Is there something wrong with him? And she's like, why? And she said, he's just so kind. He's just so kind. Is he okay? Is he struggling with something? He's normally just like, come on, he's so kind. And I said to Chris, she said, I really notice your efforts and encouragement. I said, let me just pass that out for a second. Did you notice my encouragement or my efforts at encouragement? She said, we are still at the point where I'm recognizing your efforts at encouragement, not the encouragement itself just yet. There's still work, but you're making progress. Listen, I said that this is important. People respond to gentleness, to encouragement, to being built up. We live in a critical world, and the church should be the place where you step inside and it's refreshingly encouraging for your walk with Jesus. Listen, don't be an accuser of the brethren. That job is taken by Satan. Jesus is the advocate fighting for us. You don't want to join the opposing party at the bench. And then Paul's going to go on and say that he's like a father too. He says, for you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. And he uses 3 words here. To exhort is parakaleo. It's the word we get, the same ministry as the Holy Spirit. To come alongside and to cheer someone on. So Paul said, I saw your walk of faith and I was like, let's go. Then it says that he encouraged or he comforted and consoled. This is the same Greek word that was used in John 11 when Lazarus dies and the family is brokenhearted. And it says that Jesus wept. When he saw their distress, Jesus wept. It's emotionally entering into the experience of another. And here's what Paul said. I entered in to your heartache and to your stress. I was fully present with your struggles as well. But then he also charged them. This is a very strong word in the Greek. It's the same word where we get a martyr from. It's about being a witness. It's about dying in loyalty and faithfulness to the truth. And so Paul's got this ability to say, come on, let's go. I know how hard this is, and I charge you, be faithful to the mission that you have. Listen, the best leadership contains both gentleness and challenge. If you get love without challenge, you'll produce a kind of coddling environment where no one reaches their spiritual maturity. But if you have a strong challenge environment without love, people will always feel like they're falling short and they'll feel crushed. The beauty of both challenge and comfort is what produces spiritual maturity. So I want you to see this. Paul's methods were fundamentally relational and influential and care to produce the third thing, what he was after, which is Paul's mission. Here's what Paul was after. Paul wasn't after programs or buildings. Paul was after the formation of people. It's amazing to me what churches end up being known for. Let's do a little word association, okay? Just in your minds, just don't say this out loud. When you think of Church of the City, New York, what do you associate it with? What do you think of? It's amazing how churches have become brands. So you can get a church that's known for something other than Jesus. Isn't that wild? Tell me about that church. You can get churches that are known for their charismatic emphasis. You get churches that are known for the teaching of the senior leader. Get churches that are known for their worship, churches that are known for how they serve the poor. You get churches with all of these reputations, but so often they're just human factors. Now look, sociology dictates that whenever human beings gather together, they're going to look for sort of identifying aspects with which to sort of form group cohesion, blah, blah, blah. I get it. I'm not hating on that. I'm just saying what I love about the Thessalonians and what I love about Paul's heart. Keithan talked about this the first week. They were known for their faith, hope, and love. So their reputation was about how seriously they took the Christian virtues. And Susie talked last week of how they were a model church. Paul didn't even need to say, hey, have you heard about what God's doing at the Thessalonians? He says, your faith in God has rung out. It's the same word as a trumpet blast, like Thessalonians. Here goes their faith all over the world. It's their trust in God. It's their turning from idols to serve the living and true God. It's not a personality dynamic. It's not a program. It's not a ministry distinctive. Paul's goal is to produce people. Look at what C.S. Lewis says. It is easy to think that the church has a lot of different objects: education, building, missions, holding services. But in a way, it's much more simple than that. The church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. It's even doubtful, whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. So Paul's goal for all of his labor and all of his energy wasn't to build a name for himself. It was to build people for Jesus. Look at verse 19. This is an extraordinary verse. He says this: for what is our hope and our joy, or the crown in which we will glory in the presence of the Lord Jesus when he comes? Now you think about what a New Yorker glories in. They're like, oh, he works at Goldman Sachs. I love it if you work at Goldman Sachs, okay? They just made it on Broadway. You pick your level of cultural status or secular recognition of accomplishment. These are what New Yorkers glory in. Oh, I've got a column now in the New York Times. I don't, that was an illustration. You know what I'm saying? Everybody, there's all of these things that our culture says, if you fit into these things or meet these external validation points, you have significance. Here's what Paul says. When I stand before Jesus, I'm not going to say, look how much I suffered, look how many churches I planted, look how many people I raised from the dead. By the way, I read a chunk of the New Testament. That's done well over time. Here's what he's going to stand before Jesus and say. Look at the Thessalonians. I can't believe, God, you gave me the opportunity to be a part of their story of redemption and maturity. He says, you're my glory. You're where I get my weight. You're my crown, literally. Yeah, Paul, how are you doing? Oh, man, I'm doing so well. Why? Thessalonians, man, walking with Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, faithful under persecution. What's your joy? What's your crown? What's your glory? Are you literally like, I cannot believe who's in my small group? Dude, blowing my mind. I can't believe I get to be in the room with these people. Why do they let me in? Or we're like, it's okay, they talk too much. I mean, it's amazing to me how often our glory and our joy and our weight and our significance is rooted in secular things rather than godly things. Paul's heart, I want people, not self-recognition. And then his vision is that they would live lives worthy of God, that they would reach their full redemptive potential. This idea of living a life worthy of God, this is what he's urging him on. Greek word axios is where we get the term sort of an axis, something that literally is like a weight and a scale. And what he's wanting him to say is you can live a trivial life. Even in the first century, without phones, without social media, without online gaming, without Fortnite, you could still live a trivial life. And here's what he wanted to say: make wise choices to be deep people of maturity and substance based on who's called you and the glory that awaits to you. That is his whole vision. It's his whole vision. Now, Paul had something to say about restoring credibility in a time of crisis. But I want to take just a closing time here, which is very short. And I just want to talk about how we rebuild trust in New York. Like, I got a confession. Most of the time when I meet people and they say, what do you do for a living? I just tell them I write books. I do write books. It's not a lie, okay? Why do you tell them that? Because I don't want a 45-minute lecture about how much the church sucks when I first meet someone. So often people, what do you do? Well, I'm an evangelical pastor working for the glory of God and the edification of the church right there in the heart of Midtown. It's called Hell's Kitchen, but we're working on it becoming Heaven's Kitchen. Oh. There's such a credibility crisis. So what do we do? Well, number one, I want to start by saying, if you've been hurt by the church, some of you, it's taking every ounce of courage you have to come on Sundays. Listen, I get it. I've been hurt by the church too. The greatest pain in my life has been from Christians. Non-Christians don't have the Holy Spirit, so I don't expect them to live by the fruit of the Spirit or to have Spirit-filled lives. I just expect them to I believe in common grace and they're made in the image of God, and I'll take what I can get. I'm grateful for it. But Christians are meant to be like Jesus. There's no pain like the pain when a Christian hurts you. But I want to say this, don't let disillusionment with the institution rob you of intimacy with Jesus. Jesus saved his harshest critiques for the religious leaders of his day. Those who were using power to oppress people, you know what he called them? Sons of hell, brood of vipers. He says, you cross land and sea to make a single convert, and when you disciple them into twice as much a son of hell as you are. You whitewashed tombs. You look great on the inside, but inside you're full of greed and dead men's bones. So I want you to say, whatever critiques you have, they're probably not as strong as Jesus' critiques, okay? You think about Jesus' motives. Why did Jesus do his ministry? Here's the answer. Love. How did Jesus do his ministry? Washing feet, weeping for brokenness. You can come to Jesus and you can trust your heart to him. It says a bruised reed he won't break. And a flickering wick he won't snuff out. It's like, you know, when you see a candle, it's like, oh, you're trying to get it to... Jesus is like so merciful. If you've got the slightest flicker of faith in your heart, if you bring it to Jesus, he won't crush you. Jesus only tells us about his heart in one place, and it's in Matthew 11. And this is what he says, come to me because I'm gentle and humble of heart. So you may have had terrible experiences with prideful leaders, coercive pastors, dysfunctional small group leaders, terrible youth pastors. I don't know what it is, but I want to tell you this, that Jesus will not treat you like that. Don't let disillusionment with the church rob you of intimacy with Jesus. Secondly, we have to rebuild trust as a church. It can be very, very hard in our world today to do that. On one side, if we get a little continuum here, I'm leaping forward through the slides. On one side, churches sometimes can be led by an autocracy. And the autocracy is just like, well, I'm the man of God, so what I say goes. It's worse when it's a power couple. So many churches are like Game of Thrones, man, I kid you not. I have a friend who works in a huge, huge famous institution. I'm like, what's it like working there? What's the culture like? And he said, Game of Thrones. And I was like, what's Game of Thrones? That was a joke. But on the other side, you can get leaders who fail to lead. And so they just abdicate and they just walk around like, what do you want? What do you want? They're just people pleasers. And so you don't want people pleasers and you don't want an autocracy. You want something in the middle. And you know what it is? It's accountability. You want accountability. This is the biblical vision of leadership that we see. I think so often when it comes to walking through church structures, we get disillusioned because it just seems like there's no accountability. I want to encourage you, go onto our church's website and look at the people who are on the board of our church. Just you can go to the website, church.nyc, go to the staff page, go to the board. Look at the quality of people, the competency, the leadership competency, the level of experience of the folks who are making sure that our church is keeping all of its legal compliance. And then I'll encourage you, go to the page where the elders are listed in our church. These elders have been rigorously tested and trained. They've had the fear of God put on their lives about standing before Jesus and giving an account for what they do. And so we've worked hard to have a credible system. We're trying to have increasing transparency. The fact that I'm up here talking about this is one of the ways that we're trying to help model transparency and talking about leadership and the importance of credibility and exposing our motives to have these things happen. It's our desire that our church at this time of history, in our run in New York, makes the church more beautiful and more credible and not more stained and not more blemished. And there should be fruit from this. Henry Blackaby says this: a sure indication of a successful leader is the collective and consistent testimony of those who were grateful for what they learned and how they grew while they worked under that leader. I love these phrases. A collective and consistent testimony of gratitude to be a part of something. Now, listen to me here. Leaders make decisions that make people unhappy. That's called leadership. So we're never going to have a church where everyone's just like, this is amazing. That's called a cult, okay? You're never going to get that. There will always be differences of opinions about how things should go. That's just called life. That's just called leadership. And you'll get criticism. People will be unhappy and they'll criticize. That's a part of the territory of leadership, okay? Leaders accept those responsibilities. And sometimes there'll be attacks against leaders and there'll be not scandals, but controversy. Look, Jesus was a controversial man. If you're going to be godly in an increasingly godless world, the world will hate you. Jesus says, don't be surprised that the world hates you. Some of you are like, why is the world not responding to my love? It's because the world hates what you believe, because you testify that it's in rebellion against God. Sometimes Christians are so naive. If I just love everybody, they'll love Jesus. Well, that didn't happen to Jesus. Are you better than Jesus? Here's my point. It's not about not having controversy. Faith brings controversy. It's not about having disagreements. Decisions bring disagreement. But it's about saying together there's an integrity in the process, in the methodology. There's a way that this happens where you can say, even if I don't agree with that, I respect how it was done. And that's what we're working hard to do as a church. Look, I don't want to, someone's got to get a breakthrough. Someone's got to deal with their hurt, only by the grace of God. And we're going to pass on blessing. Simone Will says this: pain and suffering are a kind of currency passed from hand to hand until they reach someone who receives them but does not pass them on. And I think that's the challenge we face. So many people disillusioned, hurt, and we got a choice. Are we then going to, in our leadership, project bitterness and complaint and cynicism? Or are we going to become a compelling alternative? And I say, I know, but like Jesus, who had done no wrong, received it, but passed on blessing instead of curse. That's the choice I think we have as a church. So I want to close tonight just by offering a time of response for 3 groups of people. The first one is maybe you're here tonight and you just need healing from church hurt. And look, man, I get that. Can I just be honest with you? I don't know how honest I'm allowed to be, but this is measured vulnerability, okay? There's sometimes I'm like, man, I've had leadership conflicts with people. And I'm like, I just prefer to take a week off church. But I'm preaching next week. And I know what it can feel like when you're like, oh, it's hard and it's challenging. It's easy to just run away. It's easy to be passive aggressive. It's easy to just go to another church and bail on it. But all we're doing is carrying our immaturity and bitterness with us. And so sometimes we need to just get before God, maybe ask for forgiveness or extend forgiveness. We just got to get reconciliation and healing. And maybe you're here tonight and you just need healing. You just need Jesus to comfort you. I know he wants to. You serve a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He doesn't treat us as our sins deserve. And maybe you need healing. Maybe you need restoration. You know, one of the things they talk about in leaders building credibility is the idea of repair. Leaders have to repair the damage they've done. Relationships need repair. And sometimes it's a quick little paint job, like, oh, there's a hole in the wall, a little patch, and then a paint. You're like, yay. And other times you've got to strip the building down to the studs. It takes 2 years and costs $1 million. It's real repair. But maybe you have got an area of your life and you need God to repair it. And I think that he would love to begin that journey of restoration tonight. Or maybe you've got a friend tonight who's gotten so disillusioned with the church. They've deconstructed their faith. They've walked away. They're just like, I can't take any more of this hypocrisy. And they are judging Jesus by the failures of the church. And you just want to pray for your friend tonight. Maybe you're a parent here tonight and you've got a kid who's walked away from God, walked away from faith, and a large portion of it is because they've had terrible experiences of church. And you just want to pray tonight that Jesus will show them a sense of his love and mission. St. Augustine said this: never judge a religion by its abuses. Don't judge the church by its abuses. Judge it by its saints and judge it by its Savior. And so maybe tonight we need to just pray for those folks. I want to invite you to stand to your feet, and we're just going to close. So I just want to say, if you need prayer for any of these things, we're definitely out of time tonight. So I want to say this: we've got prayer leaders down the front. They'd love to be able to pray for you. We're not going to be able to have an extended lingering time because the person preaching went too long, unfortunately. But I felt like, honestly, man, I put my heart into this talk because I felt like it was so important to at least get a roadmap forward about how to repair the damage that the church has experienced. So forgive me if it was a little long. Hopefully you see there was a lot that was in there of value. But I do want to say, in the window of time we have, if you need prayer, just come quickly. Don't wait, just come quickly, okay? We're going to have one song and a time of response, and then we're going to have to transition between services. If you need the mercy of God, the healing of God, you want to pray for a prodigal or someone with church hurt to come home, you just want to confess before God, Lord, I want to start a journey of repair and restoration. Whatever you need, God is here. He wants to make his church beautiful, and he wants it to start with you. So let's respond tonight.